しい線を学園長に却下されたわ。
艦長、オープンワールドの冒険依頼は毎週3回受けるチャンスがあるんだよ。忘れないでね。
艦長、任務は全部終わらせて。
Why does your mouth feel like it's on fire when you eat a spicy pepper? And how do you soothe the burn? Why does wasabi make your eyes water? And how spicy is the spiciest spice? Let's back up a bit. First, what is spiciness? Even though we often say that something tastes spicy, it's not actually a taste, like sweet or salty or sour. Instead, what's really happening is that certain compounds in spicy foods activate the type of sensory neurons called polymodal nociceptors. You have these all over your body, including your mouth and nose, and they're the same receptors that are activated by extreme heat. So when you eat a chili pepper, your mouth feels like it's burning because your brain actually thinks it's burning. The opposite happens when you eat something with menthol. The cool minty compound is activating your cold receptors. When these heat-sensitive receptors are activated, your body thinks it's in contact with dangerous resources and reacts accordingly. This is why you start to sweat and your heart starts to beat faster. The first of elicited the same fight or flight response with which your body reacts to most threats. But you may have noticed that not all spicy foods are spicy in the same way, and the difference lies in the types of compounds involved. Capsaicin and piperine found in black pepper and chili peppers are made up of larger, heavier molecules called alkyl amines, and those mostly stay in your mouth. Mustard, horseradish, and wasabi are made up of smaller molecules like isothiocyanate that easily float up into your sinuses. This is why chili peppers burn your mouth and wasabi burns your nose. The standard measure of a food's spiciness is its rating on the Scoville scale, which measures how much its capsaicin content can be diluted before the heat is no longer detectable to humans. Bell pepper gives 0 Scoville heat, while Tabasco sauce clocks in between 1200 and 2400. The race to create the hottest pepper is a constant battle, but 2 peppers generally come out on top: the Trinidad Moruga Scorpion and the Carolina Reaper. These peppers measure 1.5 and 2 million Scoville, about half is found in pepper. So why would anyone want to eat something that causes such high levels of pain? Nobody really knows when or why these happen. Archaeologists have found spices like mustard along with human artifacts dating as far back as 23,000 years ago, but they don't know whether the spices were used for food or medication or just decoration. More recently, a 6,000-year-old crock pot lined with charred fish and meat also contained mustard. One theory says that humans started adding spices to food to kill off bacteria, and some studies show that spice developed mostly in warmer climates, where microbes also happen to be more prevalent. But why we continue to subject ourselves to spicy food today is still a bit of a mystery. For some people, eating spicy food is like riding roller coasters. They enjoy the ensuing thrill, even if the immediate sensation is unpleasant. Some studies have even shown that those who like to eat hot stuff are more likely to enjoy other adrenaline-rich activities like gambling. The taste for spicy food may even be genetic. And if you're thinking about training a bit to up your tolerance for spice, know this. According to some studies, the pain doesn't get any better. You just get tougher. In fact, researchers have found that people who like to eat spicy foods don't make the burn any less painful than those who don't. They just seem to like the pain more. So torment your heat receptors all you want, but remember, when it comes to spicy food, you're going to get burned.
One fine day, when Charles Darwin was still a student at Cambridge, the budding naturalist tore some old bark off a tree and found 2 rare beetles underneath. He'd just taken 1 beetle in each hand when he spotted a 3rd beetle. Stashing one of the insects in his mouth for safety, he reached for the new specimen when a sudden spray of hot, bitter scalded his
やけど
teeth.
審判の時は来た
Darwin's assailant was the bombardier. It's one of thousands of animal species like frogs, jellyfish, salamanders, and snakes that use toxic chemicals to defend themselves. In this case, by spewing poisonous liquid from glands in its abdomen. But why doesn't this caustic substance ejected at 100 degrees Celsius hurt the female itself? In fact, how do any toxic agents survive their own secretions? The answer is that they use one of two basic strategies: or evolving resistance to it. Bombardier beetles use the first approach. They store ingredients for their poison in two separate chambers. When they're threatened, the valve between the chambers opens, and the substances combine in a violent chemical reaction that sends a corrosive spray shooting out of the glands, passing through a hardened chamber that protects the beetle's internal tissues.
やけど決戦の
Similarly,
時が来た
jellyfish package their venom safely in cartoon-like structures called venom and venomous snakes store their flesh-eating, blood-clotting combos in specialized compartments that only have one exit, through the fangs and into their prey or predator. Snakes also employ the second strategy, built-in biochemical resistance. Rattlesnakes and other types of vipers manufacture special proteins that bind and inactivate venom components in the blood. Meanwhile, poison dart frogs have also evolved resistance to their own toxins, but through a different mechanism. These tiny animals defend themselves using hundreds of bitter-tasting compounds called alkaloids that they accumulate from consuming small arthropods like mites and ants. One of their most potent alkaloids is the chemical alkaloid, which binds the same receptors in the brain as ants, but is at least 10 times stronger. An amount greatly heavier than a grain of sugar would kill you. So what prevents poison frogs from poisoning themselves? Think of the molecular target neurotoxic alkaloid as a lock, and the alkaloid itself as the key. When the toxic key slides into the lock, it sets off a cascade of chemical and electrical signals that can cause paralysis, unconsciousness, and eventually death. But if you change the shape of the lock, the key can't fit. For poison dart frogs and many other animals with neurotoxic defenses, a few genetic changes alter the structure of the alkaloid binding site just enough to keep the neurotoxin from exerting its adverse effects. Poisonous and venomous animals aren't the only ones that can develop this resistance. Their predators and prey can too. The garter snake, which dines on neurotoxic salamanders, has evolved resistance to salamander toxins from some of the same genetic changes as the salamanders themselves.
He doesn't even have.
That means that only the most toxic salamanders can avoid being eaten, and only the most resistant snakes will survive the meal. The result is that the genes providing the highest resistance and toxicity will be passed on in greatest quantities to the next generation. As toxicity ramps up, resistance does too, in an evolutionary arms race that plays out over millions of years. This pattern appears over and over again. Grasshopper mice resist painful venom from scorpion prey through genetic changes in their nervous systems. Horned lizards readily consume harvest meats, resisting their venomous sting with specialized blood vessels. And sea slugs, jellyfish, their activation of compounds in glucose. The bombardier beetle is no exception. The toads that swallow them can tolerate the caustic spray that Darwin found so mysterious. Most of the beetles are spit up hours later, amazingly alive and well. But how do the toads survive the experience? That is still a mystery. Haven't had your fill? Pick your poison with one of these two lessons.
Imagine being attacked by a ferocious predator. With no chance of escape, you do what any courageous self-respecting Tossin would do. Pull into a mobile state called catatonia, stick out your tongue, and ooze some foul-smelling liquid Disgusted, your assailant loosens its grip, decides which predator it is looking for, and departs. 10 minutes, you resurrect and merrily saunter on. From lemurs to lizards, ants to amphibians, sharks to chickens, hundreds of animals play dead as a survival tactic. You can claim possum after its scar. Human death is also called Thanatosis. That's
the
from
fuck?
Thanatos, the ancient Greek deity of death. But most scientists call it tonic immobility, or TI. How and why TI occurs depends on the species and situation. Spewing stench and adopting odd postures are common
I need to sick
and
fry
often
them.
play important roles. Other animals sacrifice their neighbors. Quail chicks that freeze while their kin run amok have a better chance of survival when
So
pursued
yeah,
by a
that
cat.
also happens.
Speaking of cats, feline mothers can pinch the napes of their kittens' necks and induce another kind of immobility called clipnosis.
Oh, so
This
don't
keeps their
so
kittens
don't.
quiet and easy to transport. Most of the physiological mechanisms underlying these theatrics originate in the parasympathetic nervous system that are known for controlling cycles of resting and digesting. In possums, the parasympathetic nervous system causes their heart rates to drop by nearly half, respiration by a third, and body temperatures by more than 100 degrees Celsius for up to an hour. The neurotransmitter dopamine also plays a part. Flower beetles with low dopamine levels play dead more frequently than those with high levels, and anything blocking dopamine receptor sites can make them catatonic. But maintaining a death ruse isn't easy. The performers are constantly gauging their surroundings for clues when they seem to rise. Chickens, for instance, can sense when a predator's eyes are upon them. Researchers know this because when they used a stuffed hawk in an experiment, their chicken subjects came out of their catatonia cover when the hawk's eyes were averted. Other animals use
How is
TI
that
for
too
purposes
fast?
other than
Fuck.
defense. When the sleeper cichlid feels peckish, it sinks to the lake floor and lies motionless, its splotchy coloration making it seem like a rotting carcass. If the small scavenger investigates, this undead trickster strikes. Some animals even feign death as a sexual ploy. Male nursery spiders offer patients of sit-backed insects, but those females are known to make love-seeking males. By playing dead while the female eagerly devours her snack, these males can cautiously revive and improve their chances of
Come on,
successfully
come on.
mating.
No.
So TI can work to an animal's advantage, unless someone else knows its secret. California orcas can flip over young great white sharks, inducing TI for so long the immobilized sharks must move to respire, essentially suffering. Humans can also flip sharks into TI by stroking the shark's electrically sensitive snout and gently turning it over. Researchers can induce TI that lasts up to 15 minutes. That's enough time to insert tags, remove hooks, and even perform surgeries. There are risks, however. TI can hamper respiration and induce hyperglycemia, a sign of stress. So this technique should only be used when necessary. Humans can also experience TI when they freeze with fear during violent assaults. Recognizing this ancient, involuntary form of self-defense has significant implications when trying to understand why some victims don't flee or fight in the face of danger. So studying TI in non-human animals not only helps us better understand some odd behaviors, it can also help us better understand our own sometimes counterintuitive responses to violence. Love animals? Check out this playlist for more videos on some of our favorite programs and social
In May of 1822, Count Christian Ludwig von Baaden shot down a stork over his castle grounds in North Germany. However, he wasn't the first person to hunt that specific bird. Upon recovering the stork, von Baaden found it impaled by a yard-long wooden spear. A local
Damn.
professor determined the weapon was African in origin. suggesting that somehow this stork was speared in Africa and then flew over 2,500 kilometers to the Count's castle. This astonishing flight wasn't just evidence of the stork's resilience, it was an essential clue in a mystery that plagued scientists for centuries: the seasonal disappearance of birds. Ancient naturalists had various theories to explain the annual vanishing act we now know as migration. Aristotle himself proposed 3 particularly popular ideas. One theory was that birds transformed into different bodies that suited the season. For example, summertime garden warblers were believed to transform into black caps every winter. In reality, these are 2 distinct species, similar in shape and size but never appearing at the same time. Over the following centuries, birds were said to morph into humans, plants, and even the timbers of ships. This last transmutation was especially popular with many Christian clergy. If barnacle geese were truly made of wood, they could be deemed vegetarian and enjoyed during meatless fasts. Aristotle's second and even more enduring hypothesis was that birds hibernate. This isn't so far-fetched. Some species do enter short, deep sleeps, which lower their heart rates and metabolisms. And there's at least one truly hibernating bird. The common porwheel sleeps out winters in the deserts of North America. But researchers were proposing much more outlandish forms of hibernation well into the 19th century. Barn swallows were said to remove their feathers and hibernate in holes, or sleep through the winter at the bottom of lakes and rivers. Aristotle's final theory was much more reasonable and resembled something like realistic migration. However, this idea was also taken to extremes. In 1666, the leading migration advocate was convinced that each winter, birds flew to the moon. It might seem strange that prominent researchers considered such bizarre ideas, but to be fair, the true story of migration may be even harder to believe than their wildest theories. Roughly 20% of all bird species migrate each year, following warm weather and fresh food around the planet. For birds who spend their summers in the northern hemisphere, this journey can span from 700 to over 17,000 kilometers, with some flights lasting as long as 4 months. Birds who migrate across oceans may soar without stopping for over 100 hours. Sleeping and eating on the fly, they navigate the endless ocean by the stars, wind currents, and Earth's magnetic field. Tracking the specifics of these epic expeditions is notoriously difficult. And while birds often take the most direct route possible, storms and human development can alter their paths, further complicating our attempts to chart migration. Fortunately, Count von Bothmer's stork offered physical proof not only that European storks were migrating south for the winter, but also where they were migrating to. Ornithologists across the continent were eager to map the trajectory of this flight, including Johannes Heinemann, owner of the world's first permanent bird observatory. Heinemann was a major public advocate for the study of birds, and to solve the field's biggest mystery, he wrangled an army of volunteers from across Germany. His team used aluminum rings to tag the legs of 2,000 storks with unique numbers and the address of his offices. Then he advertised the initiative as widely as possible. His hope was that word of the experiment would find its way to Africa, so people finding the tags would know to mail them back with more information. Sure enough, from 1908 to 1913, Heinemann received 178 rings, 48 of which had been found in Africa. Using this data, he plotted the first migration route ever discovered, and definitively established that storks were not in fact flying to the moon. Flying thousands of miles with zero navigation equipment and almost no sleep is pretty cool.
Could get
but
higher
isn't
if we
this
have
cool
silk and
as pooping
see
candy?
how
Decide for yourself with this
how
video
soft
on
avocado
the
am is.
incredible edible aphid poop. or find out how birds learn to sing with this video. Both are cool, we promise.
Nhấn thì nhấn vào lại chứ.
In 1963, scientists studying Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in New Hampshire made a shocking discovery. Their most recent rainfall samples were nearly 100 times more acidic than usual. At these levels, additional downpours of acid rain would destroy the region's marine and arboreal ecosystems in a matter of decades. Urgently sharing their findings with fellow researchers, they were determined to answer two questions. What was causing this deadly rainfall, and what could be done to stop it?
Mùi rồi.
Rain is never just composed of water. Chemicals and particulates in the atmosphere can be found in every drop, and some compounds, like carbon dioxide, make even regular rain slightly acidic. But this pales in comparison to the chemical gases produced when water oxides of nitrogen or sulfur dioxide. On the pH scale, which measures acidity, each whole number is 10 times more acidic than above, where normal pH is roughly 5.4. These gases can rank as low as 3.7. Oxides of nitrogen and sulfur dioxide can occur naturally as a short-lived byproduct of volcanic eruptions or lightning strikes. But power plants, refineries, and chemicals that use fossil fuels consistently pump large quantities of nitrogen. These dangerous gases travel through the air, spreading hundreds of kilometers from the pollution source, acting like roaming clouds of destruction. Their presence dramatically increases the acidity of local precipitation, creating acid rain, acid snow, and acid water. These all acidic lakes and streams kill acid gases and damage soil to inhibit future growth. Over time, acid rain can even corrode human structures made of stone or metal. By the 1970s, scientists in North America and Europe classified acid rain as a major environmental threat. But despite clear evidence tying the problem to air pollution, companies deny responsibility
Này trâu vậy sao?
research. In the United States, corporations lobbied against regulating pollution and convinced politicians that such
Bảo trì thì sủi thôi.
costs threaten jobs. These obstacles led the government to delay changes and mandate further research into the issue. But after a decade of mounting concern, Congress finally took action. Since the electric sulfur dioxide emissions came from power plants, the government set a limit on the total amount of it the electric power sector could emit each year. Then, they divided the permitted emissions into a fixed number of allowances distributed to each power plant. A plant could then choose
Bảo trì thì sủi là rõ.
sulfur dioxide as they were allowed, or reduce the emissions and sell their unused allowances to other power plants. This system, known as cap and trade, offered power plants the economic flexibility to keep costs low while strictly limiting emissions. Many critics called these allowances licenses to pollute, or said the government was selling clean air. But since the cap was set to low 5 years into the program, it forced every utility company to reduce emissions in the long run. Some plants added desulfurizing scrubbers to their smoke signals, switched to low sulfur fuel and natural gas. Oxides of nitrogen emissions were also reduced with relatively low cost technologies. These advances allowed the power sector to grow while the cap kept pollution under control. By 1995, Canada and the European Union adopted their own standards, and international treaties began circulating to reduce air pollution worldwide. Today, this science-driven economic policy has largely eliminated acid rain across the United States and Canada. While many ecosystems still need time
Tóc
to
kèo phải bấm 4
recover,
cái vào.
scientists have sped up the restoration of other areas by reintroducing essential organisms killed off by acid rain. Some countries like Russia, India, and China still rely heavily on high sulfur coal and continue to struggle with the environmental consequences. However, acid rain's relatively quick journey from major threat to minor issue is rightly celebrated as a victory for policies that
Để
protect
chơi
the
cái kiểu
environment.
này xem chơi được không?
Cap and trade can't solve every environmental problem, but by using scientific consensus to guide policy, adopting efficient technology, and being unafraid to impose reasonable costs for pollution, countries can stop a growing storm of destruction before it's too late. For an example of a country that took decisive
Kìa, vào sân là
action
không
to
ngắm bắn
solve
là
a
thế nào?
problem, let's talk about the Netherlands. After a
BINH á?
storm surge killed millions
BINH chơi top mid chứ ai chơi
the Dutch government created the Delta Wings, the most
BINH chỉ chơi top mid
sophisticated
thôi.
flood prevention system in the world. Find out how it keeps the Netherlands above water with this video.
After the California gold rush of 1848, white settlers streamed west, striking rich. In addition to precious metals, they unearthed another treasure, dinosaurs. Two wealthy scientists in particular, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, competed to uncover these prehistoric monsters. Marsh and Cope were first to describe iconic creatures like Brontosaurus, Triceratops, and Stegosaurus. But they also showcased the destructive whirlwind of profiteering and ambition that fueled American science during the late 1800s. Their rivalry, one of the most notorious scientific feuds in history, became known as the Bone Wars. Marsh was ill-tempered and had a knack for debunking falsehoods. One woman said that getting to know him was like running against a benchman. Cope, on the other hand, was charismatic, given to bold theorizing, but he was also sarcastic and temperamental. By his own admission, he wasn't constructed for getting along comfortably with the general run. When Marsh and Cope first met in 1864, they were friendly, and each named a new species in the other's honor. But their relationship soon soured. In 1868, Cope took Marsh to a quarry near his home in New Jersey, where one of the most complete dinosaur skeletons to date had recently been discovered. Sensing an opportunity, Marsh paid the mine operators to send him the most interesting new finds. Outraged, Cope accused Marsh of bribery. That same year, Cope showed Marsh his reconstruction of a new marine reptile called Elasmosaurus. Marsh immediately noticed that something was wrong. Cope had mistaken the creature's long neck for its tail. When Cope's mentor sided with Marsh, Cope was mortified. He tried to buy and destroy every copy of the article containing his blunder, but to no avail. Their mutual resentment blossomed. After the Transcontinental Railroad was completed the following year, Cope and Marsh began scouring the American West for fossils. They found riches the likes of which neither had dreamed of. Relying on the help of Native American guides, Marsh made some especially significant discoveries, like ancient birds with teeth that are still celebrated as a missing link between dinosaurs and modern birds. Cope made important discoveries too, but Marsh successfully invalidated many of them, showing them to be redundant with other known species. Enraged, Cope tried to secure priority for new findings by announcing them via telegram. He even purchased a respected journal so future publications could be rushed into print. But Marsh used his personal fortune to gain the upper hand, hiring a small army of fossil hunters to outcompete his rival. In 1878, Marsh bought an especially promising quarry in Como Bluff, Wyoming, from two frontier collectors. It yielded tons of fossils, including the near-complete skeleton of a gigantic dinosaur that Marsh named Brontosaurus. Over the next 10 years, his men shipped him more than 480 boxes of dinosaur bones from Como. Marsh named dozens of new species, but his assistants could be ruthless in their quest to further Marsh's scientific ambitions. They sometimes destroyed fossils just to prevent them from falling into close hands. Desperate to catch up with Marsh, Cope invested his dwindling fortune into silver mining. The gamble failed, and he was left nearly destitute. While Cope contemplated selling his precious collection, Marsh was named lead paleontologist for the U.S. Geological Survey. This well-funded branch of the government often sponsored westward expeditions, giving Marsh even more resources to vanquish rivals. The Bone Wars spilled into public view when Cope had a tabloid newspaper publish
so
an
wrong,
article
man.
accusing Marsh of plagiarism, fraud, and corruption. Marsh fired back, and the two further tarnished each other's reputations. Neither ever relented.
How the
When
fuck
Cope
can I lack of
died, he
SD?
donated
Like,
his
how the
skull to
fuck?
science, hoping to prove that his brain was larger than that of his enemy. Marsh never accepted the challenge. Although Marsh named more species than Cope, both men greatly expanded our understanding of evolution. But their egotistical one-upmanship reminds us that, in spite of its ideals, science is a personal enterprise conducted by individual and at times deeply flawed human beings. Cope and Marsh are far from history's only scientific rivals. In 1910, two explorers competed to reach the last unmapped region of Earth, the South Pole. Who would prove victorious? Join the dangerous journey to find out with this video.
行きましょう。出発です。かくれんぼを始めようか。やよ戻れ。
On December 12th, Chief Wantu made 120 Every twig represented a person and his life. He died because he became all Chief Wantu separated the twigs into 4 piles: tribal nobles, men, women, and children. Then proceeded to name the dead. His testimony joined hundreds of others to help bring an end to one of the greatest atrocities in history. Beginning in the late 1800s, European countries participated in the so-called scramble ground. They colonized 90% of the continent, exploiting African resources and enriching their country. Belgium had
Not any faster.
its ruler, Leopold II, wanted to acquire what he called
Scam.
a slice of this magnificent African cake. Meanwhile, he read colonial explorer Henry Morton Stanley's reports about traveling through Africa. Stanley emphasized the Congo Basin's majesty. So, in 1879, Leopold contracted him to return to the Congo. There, Stanley deceived leaders into signing
Sheesh.
Towering 85 meters above the Norwegian countryside, Mjøstårnet cuts a sleek shape in the rural skyline. Housing 18 stories of restaurants, apartments, and hotel rooms,
18
this modern
stories.
building might seem out of place, but a deeper look reveals it actually blends in quite well among the forested farmlands. This is likely because Mjøstårnet is the world's tallest wooden building, made almost entirely from the trees of neighboring forests. Until the end of the 20th century, engineers thought it was impossible to build a wooden building over 6 stories tall. Traditional boards of lumber were fairly strong against forces parallel to the wood's fiber growth, but they were vulnerable to forces applied perpendicular to this direction. As a result, wood lacked steel's tensile strength, or concrete's compressive strength, each necessary to support tall buildings and battle the powerful winds found at high altitudes. But the early 1890s saw the invention of glue-laminated timber, or glulam, and a century later, engineers developed cross-laminated timber, or CLT. These new wooden materials start out like all other lumber. A freshly cut log is sawed into smooth, uniform boards of wood. Then, in the case of
That
CLT,
time.
the boards are glued together in alternating orientations, with each layer set at 90 degrees to its neighbors. The resulting material benefits from wood's structural rigidity in every direction, allowing it to mimic the compressive strength of concrete and bear loads up to 20 times heavier than traditional lumber. Glue rail, on the other hand, glues boards together in the same direction, forming massive beams with tensile strength
Rồi SP đâu?
comparable to steel.
Mid kia rồi SP
Glue
đâu?
isn't as versatile as CLT,
Mid kia
but
người
its
ta
incredible
ASS người ta mới
strength
dùng.
along one direction makes it superior
Của bác
to
SP
load-bearing
đâu?
beams and columns. These engineered forms of wood could finally compete with traditional materials, while also bringing their own
vô
unique
hả?
set of advantages. At 1/5 the weight of concrete, building with CLT
Xét không xét.
requires smaller cranes, smaller foundations, and fewer construction workers.
Giàu quá,
While
rã bớt cho
concrete
nó đẹp.
has to undergo a time-intensive process of casting and curing in a mold, timber can be shaped quickly using computer-directed cutting machines. And where concrete requires
Wow,
certain
rã bớt.
weather and timing conditions to be poured on site, engineered wood can be prefabricated in a factory, creating standardized parts with clear instructions for assembly. Taken together, these materials allow for faster and quieter construction, with more biodegradable materials and less waste. Once constructed, CLT and UON buildings are also more resilient to some natural disasters. An earthquake can crack concrete, permanently weakening the entire structure, but cracked wood beams can be easily replaced. The same is true for fire safety. As temperatures rise in CLT, materials to char, insulating flames for up to 3 hours. This is more than enough time to evacuate most buildings, and once the smoke is settled, charred panels can be swapped out, unlike melted steel beams. But perhaps the biggest benefits of CLT and UON are outside the construction site. Building construction is responsible for 11% of global carbon emissions, and the production of steel, iron, and glass are major contributors to that figure. Timber, however, is a renewable resource that can be made carbon neutral if trees are planted instead of cut down. Wood also has low thermal conductivity, making it easier to plant in buildings with less energy waste. Despite these advantages, CLT requires vastly more lumber than traditional wooden construction. And when compared in similar quantities, neither CLT or UON is as strong as steel or concrete. Even the used Thornet isn't made entirely of wood, as it contains concrete slabs to reinforce the upper floors. Taken together, it's unlikely that a purely wooden structure could be strong enough to support a 40-story building with a minimum 3-story walls. But even if only buildings under 30 stories were built from wood, it would reduce the carbon footprint of those structures by more than 25%. So no matter how tall these wooden buildings rise, each one contributes to the health of our concrete junkies. Speaking of health, what if cracked concrete could fix itself? This revolutionary technology could save resources and lives. Learn what the secret ingredient is with this video.
Vòng
In
luôn.
1978, Diane Hartley was writing her undergraduate architecture thesis when she made a shocking discovery. Her paper focused on the City Corp Center, a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. And after weeks poring over the building's plans, she'd stumbled on a potentially deadly mistake. An oversight that threatened to topple the 59-story tower into one of New York City's most densely populated districts. When it was built 2 years earlier, City Corp Center was one of the world's tallest buildings. Its sloped roof was unique in the city skyline, but its more distinctive feature lay at the base. Since the construction site was already occupied by St. Peter's Lutheran
trời,
Church,
SP đâu?
the new skyscraper had to be built on columns, supporting it like stilts. Using stilts on a building's corners wasn't unheard of, but because the church stood at the corner of the block, these stilts had to be placed at the center of each side. While this novel design worried some of the building's backers, Chief Structural Engineer William Lemessurier took numerous precautions to ensure the building's stability. The outside would consist of V-shaped chevrons, forming a strong exoskeleton to support the skyscraper. This external structure also made the building much lighter, meaning there'd be less weight to support overall. This design did leave the building vulnerable to strong winds, but Le Mesurier had another state-of-the-art solution, a tuned mass damper. This 400-ton counterweight was controlled by computerized sensors designed to counteract any swaying. With these structures in place, calculations showed that each side of the building could withstand powerful
chấm mất 20 điểm rồi đó.
and with all safety issues resolved, the building opened for business in 1977. But when Hartley was studying the tower a year later, she noticed something odd. It was true that each face of the building could endure powerful winds, and since a building's broad sides catch the most wind, these would typically be the strongest winds a building encounters. However, the tower's unique base meant that winds blowing on the building's corners were actually the bigger threat. And since traditional designs didn't warrant safety calculations for corner winds, it seemed to Hartley that the threat had gone unaccounted for. When Hartley contacted Le Mesurier's firm about the issue, they assured her the building was strong enough to handle these winds. But checking the plans again, Le Mesurier noticed an alarming detail. A change, approved without his knowledge, had replaced the exoskeleton's welded joints with cheaper and weaker bolted joints. This alone wasn't enough to topple the tower thanks to the mass damper, but if a storm knocked out the building's power, it would deactivate the counterweight sensors, leaving the building vulnerable to winds of just 112 kilometers per hour. Given available weather data, a storm this strong had a 1 in 16 chance of hitting New York City every single year. Le Mesurier never told Hartley what she'd uncovered. In fact, everything he did next was top secret. After filling in the architects and executives at Citicorp, Le Mesurier's team worked with city officials to craft a confidential plan. Without warning the residents, construction crews began a string of nighttime shifts to reinforce the bolted joints. This delicate work began in mid-August 1978 and was only halfway complete when Hurricane Ella approached the city in September. City officials and Citicorp executives planned an emergency evacuation for a 10-block radius, but at the last minute, the hurricane veered out to sea. These secret evacuation plans were never used, and the reinforcements were completed just a month later. Typically, it would have been impossible for this covert construction to go unnoticed, but the press was occupied with a newspaper strike spanning the length of the reinforcement project. In fact, the public didn't learn how close they'd come to disaster until 1995, when a New Yorker article revealed the story to the city and Diane Hartley. Like Le Mesurier, the article failed to give credit where it was due, but at least Hartley knew that her homework had saved lives. Okay, we know what you're thinking. What about the Leaning Tower of Pisa? Is it going to fall? Find out with this video. We'll learn more about the limits of skyscrapers with this video.
In the mid-19th century, suspension bridges were collapsing all across Europe. Their industrial cables frayed during turbulent weather and snapped under the weight of their decks. So when a German-American engineer named John Roebling proposed building the largest and most expensive suspension bridge ever conceived over New York's East River, city officials were understandably skeptical. But Manhattan was increasingly overcrowded, and commuters from Brooklyn clogged the river. In February of 1867, the government approved Roebling's proposal. To avoid the failures of European bridges, Roebling designed a hybrid bridge model. From suspension bridges, he incorporated large cables supported by central pillars and anchored at each bank. This design was ideal for supporting long decks, which come from smaller vertical cables. But Roebling's model also grew orientated stay bridges. These shorter structures held up their decks with diagonal cables that went directly to ceiling towers. By adding these additional cables, Roebling improved the bridge's stability, while also bridge's deck spanned over 480 meters, 1.5 times longer than any previously built suspension bridge. Since standard hemp rope would tear under the deck's 14,680 tons, his proposal called for over 5,600 kilometers of metal wire to create the bridge's cables. To support all this weight, the towers would need to stand over 90 meters above sea level, making them the tallest structures in the Western Hemisphere. Roebling was confident his design would work, but while surveying the site in 1869, he rushed his plan and adopted it within a month of its submittal. Fortunately, John Roebling's son Washington was also a trained engineer and took over his father's role. Following construction on the tower foundations finally began. This first step in construction was also the most challenging. Building on the rocky riverbed involved the use of a largely untested technology, pneumatic basins. Workers lowered these airtight wooden boxes into the river, where a system of pipes pumped pressurized air in and water out. Once established, airlocks allowed workers to enter the chamber and excavate the river bottom. They placed layers of stone on top of the basin as they dug.
Wow.
When it finally hit
That
the bedrock,
is
they
that
filled it with concrete, becoming the tower's permanent foundation. Working conditions in these cases were dismal and dangerous. Lit only by candles and gas lamps, the chambers caught fire several times, forcing them to be evacuated and flooded. Even more dangerous is the mysterious ailment called the BINH. Today, we understand this
Actually, we don't need that.
dizziness that killed several workers. In 1872, it nearly claimed the life of the chief engineer. Washington survived, but was left paralyzed and bedridden. Yet once again, the Roeblings proved indomitable. Washington's wife not only carried communications between the country and the
We need that IE
but
combo,
soon
you know,
took
for
over
SP.
day-to-day project management. Unfortunately, the bridge's troubles were far from over. By 1877, construction was over budget and behind schedule. Worse still, it turned out the bridge's cable contractor had been selling them faulty wires. This would have been a fatal flaw if not for the abundant fail-safes in John Roebling's design. Reinforcing the cable's traditional wires, they suspended the deck in spikes. It took 14 years, the modern equivalent of over $1 billion, and the lights worked under these different Roeblings. But when the Brooklyn Bridge finally opened on May 24, 1883, its splendor was undeniable. Today, the Brooklyn Bridge still stands atop its antique basins, supporting the Gothic towers and intersecting cables that frame a gateway to New York City. Building bridges is cool, but what about subterranean trains? How did
What
they
the
dig
heck?
massive tunnels under bustling cities over 150 years ago? Answer all your burning questions with this animation on the origins of the London Underground.
For CSP, that suck.
美しい世界を守るために時期を見て動くマシン
It was the dawn of 1863, and London's not yet open subway system, the first of its kind in the world, had the city on
No,
digging a hole under the city and putting a railroad in it seemed
that's not how it works.
pub drinkers scoffed at the idea, and a local minister accused the railway company of trying to imitate that. Most people simply thought the project, which cost more than $100 million in today's money, would never work. But it did. On January 10, 1863, 30,000 people ventured underground to travel on the world's first subway on a 4-mile stretch of line in London. After 3 years of construction and a few setbacks, the Metropolitan Railway was ready for business. The city's officials were much relieved. They'd been desperate to find a way to reduce the terrible congestion on the roads. London, at the time the world's largest and most prosperous city was in a permanent state of gridlock, with carts, costermongers, cows, and commuters jamming the roads. It had been a Victorian vision of Charles Pearson who first thought of putting railways under the ground. He lobbied for underground trains throughout the 1840s, but opponents thought the idea was impractical, since the railroads at the time only had short tunnels under hills. How could you get a railway through the center of a city? The answer was a simple system called cut and cover. Workers had to dig a huge trench, construct a tunnel out of brick archways, and then rebuild the tunnel when the rebuilt. Because this was disruptive and required the demolition of buildings above the tunnels, most of the line went under existing roads. Of course, there were accidents. On one occasion, a heavy rainstorm flooded the nearby sewers and burst through the excavation, delaying the project by several months.
What the fuck?
But as soon as the
Still
Metropolitan
no damage.
Railway opened, Londoners rushed in to ride
This
the
is
new
so
trains.
fucked.
The Metropolitan quickly became a vital part of London's transport system. Additional lines were soon built,
What
and new
the hell?
suburbs
How can
grew around the stations.
I'm gonna have no damage.
Big department stores opened next to the railroad, and the railway company
I'll blame
even
Fusi
created
then.
attractions like a
Fusi
30-story
to Tsar.
Ferris wheel in
It's too
Earl's
weak.
Court to bring in tourists by train. Within 30
Everyone's
years,
cheering
London's
now.
subway system covered 80 kilometers, with lines in the center of town running in tunnels, and suburban trains operating on the surface, often on embankments. But London was still growing, and everyone wanted to be connected to the system. By the late 1880s, the city had become too dense with buildings, sewers, and electric cables for the cut and cover technique, so a new system had to be devised. Using a machine called the Great Head Shield, a team of just 12 workers could bore through the earth, carving deep underground tunnels through the London clay. These new lines, called tubes, were at very advanced, but usually about 25 meters deep with cut and cover lines. This meant their construction didn't disturb the surface, and it was possible to dig through the walls. The first tube line, the City in South London, opened in 1890 and proved so successful that half a dozen more lines were built in the next 20 years. This clever new technology was even used to burrow several lines under London's river, the Thames. By the early 20th century, Budapest, Berlin, Paris, and New York all built subways of their own. And today, with more than 160 cities in 55 countries using underground rails to combat congestion, we can thank Charles Pearson and the Metropolitan Railway for getting us started on the right track. When we make lessons about the innovations that have changed the world, we often wonder, what's next? Which one of our young subscribers will invent something that will make the world a better place? And how can we help make space for those ideas to be heard? That's where our Student Voice Initiative, NGUYEN, comes in. Whether inventing ways to recycle styrofoam or prevent silent heart attacks, young people around the world are brilliant. Visit ed.ted.com/clubs to learn more about developing and sharing student ideas on the TED platform.
6567.
One of the great things about science is that when scientists it's not always prescribed only in a laboratory with strict settings with white light and all sorts of in reality, the events and people caused some of the major scientific discoveries are very different. Of the cells.
Phải liệu.
All organisms are composed of one or more cells. The cells that and three. All cells come from to be honest, this all sounds incredibly boring. Microscopic
この絵の具ちゃんと
Damn.
Hot item. Every naturalist or scientist at the time making it more like an iPad. One such person was a fellow Dutchman by the name of Honk, and instead of going out and buying one, he decided to make his own. Stuck two together, you couldn't see much out of. Anywho, once Leeuwenhoek had his microscope ready, he went to town looking at anything and everything he could with them, including the gunk on his teeth. Yes, you heard right. He actually discovered bacteria by looking at dental scrapings. But you have to keep in mind that people didn't brush their teeth much at all. He must have had a ugly bunch of bacteria to look at.
Damn. So freaking tiny. Monks slept in their monasteries. Dorm rooms, but without the TVs, computers, and really annoying roommates. Damn. Let's try to get some music. Classical music for relaxation. No, I don't need that. Oh, this is Miss Sue. This is strong. What the heck? Damn. That time. Where did I get the damage from? Scam. Oh, no useful. Time to die again.
美しい 決戦の時が来た。
時期を見て動きましょう。
Nope. That's definitely not enough.
美しい世界を
時期を見て動きましょう。
美しい世界を守るため
時期を見て動きましょう。5秒数に万物となる。
この列全てを断ち切る。審判の時は来た。審判の時は来た。
すぐに楽にしてやる。炎上の光。
この列全てを断ち切る。決戦の時は来た。決戦の時は来た。
5秒数に万物となる。
烈焰粉塵。審判の時は来た。
Wow, dead. Dead.
美しい世界を守るため
時期を見て動きましょう。5秒数に万物となる。
火炎罰剣。
No, that's not possible.
決戦の時が来た。審判の時は来た。
出発です。行きましょう。時間は待ってくれないぞ。かくれんぼを始めようか。炎上の光。
私の番だ。
Fuck. SQT Hiya.
美しい世界を守るため
時期を見て動きましょう。
I only wish to get 600.
美しい世界を守るため
時期を見て動きましょう。炎上の光。
火炎罰剣。
Thế bật lên để làm gì? Hỏi luôn, giờ bật lên để làm gì? Bật lên mất thời gian không? Chưa kể con đấy mà QTE là con sau. Cái cooldown từ 8 giây, từ 4 giây lên 8 giây. Nên là trừ trường hợp mà QTE lấy đam to như HOF thì không nói, còn lại tắt hết. Như con Raven là tắt QTE, AE là tắt đương nhiên. Ồ mẹ, đừng góc khuất quá. Bú. Ồ kìa, sao lại không ulti? Ạc đông khác ạc S13 là ạc S13 SS best xịn. Ạc đông là S0 S cùi nữa. Bú. Rồi đi luôn. Sheesh. I always forget.
時期を見て動きましょう。炎上の光。
烈焰粉塵審判の時は来た決戦の時が来た
かくれんぼを始めようか。時期5秒数数万物となる。
やけどに中このレッ
Vãi, còn có Fushi chưa hồi.
決戦
Lại
の
cả
時が
Fushi.
来た 決戦の時が来た 美しい世界を守るために
時期を見て動きましょう。
Con này bủ thế này, con này thiết kế để chơi hai rod.
美しい世
Chơi ba rod thì mình thì bắn rất là khó.
動きましょう。 5秒数数万物となる。
Chơi ba rod nó không có mở pháo cho mình bắn.
美しい世界を守るために
時期を見て動きましょう。
美しい世界を守るために
時期を見て動きましょう。 5秒数数万物となる。
やけどに中火炎罰剣審判の時は来た
時期を見て動きましょう。
審判の時は来た
かくれんぼを始めようか。時期炎上の光。
烈焰粉塵審判の時は来た
Đó, có Fushi cũng thế, mà không có Fushi đan cũng thế.
決戦の時が来た
時
Ôi trời ơi, SP đâu?
美しい世界を守るために時期を見て動きましょう。
Nó không mở nắp cho mà bắn đi.
美しい世界を守るために時期を見て動きましょう。
Blur.
美しい世界を守るため時期を見て動きましょう。
Được luôn. Nào đấy. Để tôi thử phát.
美しい世界を守るため時期を見て動きましょう。
Nghe hơi xú nha.
美しい世界を守るため時期を見て動きましょう。 やけどに注意。このレッドすべてを断ち切る。審判の時は来た。 審判の時は来た。
Xuống. Ủa, Nam đâu? Nam que à?
出発です。 行きましょう。かくれんぼを始めようか。時期を5秒推進。万物となる。このレッドすべてを断ち切る。
Không đủ đâu.
決戦の時は来た。 審判の時は来た。 このレッドすべてを断ち切る。審判の時は来た。私の番、文句はないよね。
Đấy rồi. Thiếu tí đam.
みんなの祝福を胸に。
Khúc đấy khó mà ăn được cái cục kia. Càng đấy 594 là không ăn được đâu. À 593. Thế là mình snipe thì vẫn được thôi. Không biết là mình có snipe nổi không. 594 bro.
美しい世界を守るため時期を見て動きましょう。
Rồi tôi nghĩ là phải chơi trick cho con HOF búng tay trước,
美しい
xong rồi con AE vào làm,
審判の時は来た。時期を見て動きましょう。
xong con AE vào làm thứ tạo lao thì may ra con HOF được một tí đam.
審判の時は来た。美しい世界を守ると。審判の時は来た。時期を見て動きましょう。
Khó, này khó này.
美しい世界を審判の時は来た。
Hay là mất 10 điểm rồi. Ủa sao lại ảo ta? Kiểu kia là ulti được một củ 9, kiểu này ulti còn có củ 7 là sao? Ô vãi lều đam bé hơn kìa. Hay là chưa bắn trúng ấy nhỉ? Ô một củ 7 rõ ràng kìa. Vãi lều. Đây củ 9 cần 2 củ nhá, bại cả lều. Là thế nào nhỉ? Đẹp. Còn Fushi bị ngu rồi. Bú. Bắn tỷ 5 mới trúng được cái weak spot của nó. Đấy, mong là mình snipe được. Đâu dù. Bắn tỷ 5 được cái weak spot. Cơ mà nếu con Fushi không bị A đùi là ngon rồi. Có khi lên được 610 điểm. Đấy là trúng cái quick spot mới có đam to thế đấy. Không có cái nịt. Đây có Fushi đây rồi. Ô ô kìa. Ô kìa. Ô kìa. Bro. Ủa gì? Ủa gì vãi lều. Không hiểu bắn nó đang bắn ngắm nó đang bắn được kiểu gì ta, xanh trong chóng thế thì mình bắn được gì. Vòng luôn. Mày quá, Fushi không vụ. Thôi lười quay quá. Thôi quay phát nhỉ. Để tính thế nào. Quên bật Nvidia overlay. Nội chơi VR chat phải tắt cái overlay đi. Nào, Nvidia mở nào em. GeForce Experience. Gì ai mượn control panel của bạn? Shì. Mở mỗi overlay mà lâu thế. Là khoảng 2 phút. 2 phút mà trừ đi time stop ngồi các thứ nữa là 3 phút. Chắc đủ. Instant replay is now on. Bên trước đánh được gần 660. Bên này bù vãi lều. Stream thì nó hơi bù. Với lại nó có nhạc nữa. Với lại chất lượng của stream thì nó không cao lắm. Từ để check xem nó có hoạt động không đã. Sao không thấy hiện gì hết. cộng à. HUD layout. Layout đâu không biết là đang bật hay đang tắt luôn.
美しい世界を守るため時期を見て動きましょう。炎上の光。やれを戻れ。この列車全てを断ち切る。審判の時は来た。 楽にしてやる。5秒数数万物となれ。この列車全てを断ち切る。決戦の時が来た。
fail.
美しい世界を守るため時期を見て動きましょう。 時は来た。
Mũ mũ nặng nặng mũ mũ lơ máu.
行きましょう。すぐに楽にしてやる。
Ủa kìa.
時期5秒数数万物となる。
May ở Fuji nó hồi kịp cho đấy.
決戦の時が来た。 やけどに注意。決戦の時が来た。 かくれんぼを始めようか。 炎上の光。このレック全てを断ち切る。審判の時は来た。
Vậy có thể tính ra là mình có thể skip được cái rót giữa một chút để ăn cao hơn.
また勝ったよ。見てくれてるよね。
Vãi lều. A supported game is required to use this feature. What the fuck? Nó nếu lưu ngoại. What the fuck? NVIDIA not working. Đủ. Đủ. Bảo sao nó không hiện, nó không hiện. Nó không hiện layout. Nó không hiện HUD layout. Đủ. Cái card NVIDIA nó không nhận game Honk Impact là một game, thế là nó không quay video được.
美しい世界を守るため
時期を見て動きましょう。天井の光。
美しい世界を守るため
時期を見て動きましょう。天井の光。
月縁粉塵決戦の時が来た審判の時は来た
出発です。
行きましょう
かくれんぼを始めようか。5秒数数万物となれ。
この列島全てを断ち切る審判の時は来たリアルのターンせいややせいや
背後に気をつけるんだな。戻れ。時期を見て。
決戦の時が来た
すぐに楽にしてやる。
美しい世界を守るため
時期を見て動きましょう。
美しい世界を守るため
時期を見て動きましょう。5秒数数万物となれ。
この列島全てを断ち切る審判の時は来た
時期を見て動きましょう。
やけどに審判の時は来た
出発です。行きましょう。出発です。かくれんぼを始めようか。天井の光。
月縁粉塵審判の時は来たやけどに注意決戦の時が来た
遅すぎるぞ。時期を見て動きましょう。
美しい世界を守るため
時期を見て動きましょう。天井の光。背後に気をつけるんだな。
月縁粉塵 判の時は来た。
時期を見て動きましょう。出発です。行きましょう。
かくれんぼを始めようか。
時期5秒進み万物となれ。
烈焰粉塵。決戦の時は来た。
時期を見て
審判の時は来た。
すぐに楽にしてやる。私が追いつけるか。
炎上の光。
やけどに注意してね。このレッド全てを断ち切る。審判の時は来た。美しい世界を守るため。
時期を見て動きましょう。
時間ではない。美しい世界を守るため。
時期を見て動きましょう。
美しい世界を守るため。
時期を見て動きましょう。炎上の光。
ハードに気をつけるんだな。
このレッド全てを断ち切る。決戦の時が来た。
時期を見て動きましょう。
審判の時は来た。
時期を見て動きましょう。
すぐに楽にしてやる。
時期を5秒進み万物となれ。
美しい世界を守るため。
時期を見て動きましょう。
美しい世界を守るため。
時期を見て動きましょう。5秒進み万物となれ。
このレッド全てを断ち切る。決戦の時が来た。
時期を見て動きましょう。
審判の時は来た。
出発です。行きましょう。
魔性は何だぞよ。力は何だぞよ。
行きましょう。
時間は待ってくれないぞ。すぐに楽にしてやる。
時期炎上の光。
このレッド全
万物となれ。
美しい世界を守るため
時期を見て動きましょう。炎上の光。背後に気をつけるんだな。
火炎罰剣審判の時は来た。決戦の時が来た。
出発です。行きましょう。かくれんぼを始めようか。5秒送水、万物となる。
烈焰粉塵決戦の時が来た。烈焰粉塵審判の時は来た。また勝ったよ。見てくれてるよね。今週はよくできました。しかし目標まで